All right, so we are back at Erasmus. We are back at the beginning of the Reformation, and we're going to pick up where we left off last week. We're not going to go through a whole lot of review because I've got a lot I still want to cover. So let's see here. I'm looking for my slide where I have to start. Here we go. All right, and so we picked up, we last week we were talking about 1 John 5, 7 through 8, and the portion of those verses that we call the Johannine comma, or the comma Johannine, depending on which you put first, or Johannine if you don't want to pronounce the J. Either way, what the Johannine comma is if you open your Bibles to 1 John chapter 5 and verse 6, and you read through verse 8, depending on your translation, you may have a section in that text, or you may not have a section in that text, and it might be relegated to the footnote, depending on which translation you're using. And that section that is in the NKJV and the KJV and the MEV and Reformation era Bibles is, except for a couple, is the in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one, and there are three that bear witness on earth. This is in some translations, this whole phrase, but in other translations, it's not here, and you might find it in the footnote. And so the question is why do we have it in some translations, and why don't we have it in other translations? And as you'll see here, we also mentioned that Erasmus's first and second editions do not have it, and Erasmus's third to fifth editions added it. And so the question came to be, why did Erasmus not have it initially, and why did he add it later? And we talked about the fact that he had 7 manuscripts, and from those 7 manuscripts, he did not have the comma in them. I'm going to just move right through all of this, and we're going to get actually right to the end slide here. I think this one. Perfect. All right, so he gave a bunch of reasons why he did not include the comma in his first 2 editions. The first one is he had no Greek support to include it. The second one, Cyril does an apologetic against the Arians who are anti-Trinitarian. He quotes 1 John 5, 6 through 8, and does not quote the comma, does not make reference to it. So he says Cyril doesn't make reference to it. And Erasmus is being accused of being anti-Trinitarian because he won't include this verse, verse and a half. He won't include it. And he says, well, Cyril didn't include it. And Cyril is the church father who's known for his apologetic for the Trinity. So if he's not anti-Trinitarian for not including it, I shouldn't be considered anti-Trinitarian for not including it. Lack of attestation from the Venerable Bede. Venerable Bede does a verse-by-verse commentary. When he gets to 1 John 5, he does not make mention at all of the comma, and he postdates Jerome. They give him another manuscript. That manuscript has a recent marginal note put in there. He says it's obvious that they included it in order to cause him to add it. Because remember, the Roman Church is adamant that this verse needs to be in there, and he's saying it shouldn't be in there. We need to update the Latin Vulgate to remove it. And they say, no, include it. And he says, I don't have any evidence to include it. So they give him some evidence. And this one happens to be the comma in the marginal note. And he says, not good enough. Lack of patristic evidence. This was interesting. So what Erasmus was saying was no one before Jerome is using it. And he goes back to Cyril. No one contemporary with Jerome is using it. And no one after Jerome is using the comma. Now, when I say no one after Jerome is using the comma, I don't mean like for all time. Seems like his time frame seems to be from anything before Jerome. He looked for anything before Jerome. And then he looked all the way up to Venerable Bede, which is 2 centuries after Jerome. So Jerome's been dead for a couple of centuries. Eventually, after that 2-century mark, we start seeing the comma showing up in the Latin manuscripts. So there will be commentators later who do use it, but no one contemporary, immediately after, or any time before Jerome was using the comma. Then he questions Jerome, because we talked about Jerome had a preface in which he said that the verse was removed and he was restoring it, he goes back and he says Jerome gives no criteria by which he determined that this was scripture, and therefore he doubts it. And also, we look today, and that preface probably doesn't belong to Jerome. It looks like it was written by a later hand. And GA 61 is a manuscript that they did bring to Jerome. I mean, not Jerome, Erasmus. They brought it to Erasmus and they said, look, here's a Greek manuscript that does contain the comma. And Erasmus looked at it. He said, you're right. This Greek manuscript does contain the comma. And for the sake of peace and unity and to stop being attacked for this issue, I will include it, but I'm going to include it with protest. And he writes a bunch of notes about it. GA 61 is a manuscript that was written contemporary with Erasmus, meaning it's not an ancient manuscript. It was written in his lifetime. And we know it was written in his lifetime. He says it looks recent. He can tell it's recent. And if you go through GA 61 is the entire New Testament complete. And it makes references to Erasmus's first edition. So this manuscript was written sometime after Erasmus wrote his first edition, but before he released his second edition. So right in that time period. So he says, fine, I'll include it. He also says that he consulted other manuscripts other than the 7 that he had and could not find it. And obvious interpolation from the Complutensian Polyglot. What's actually interesting about this, one of the benefits to having these released online is people listen to it and then they give me feedback. And so I'll get a couple of feedbacks today. But someone said, hey, we actually have letters from Erasmus to Hymenes chiding with him saying, oh, I noticed that you put the comma in. Produce the manuscript. Produce the Greek manuscript where you got it from. I guess he does this a few times, and Hymenes never produces the Greek manuscript. And Erasmus's accusation is that they didn't actually have a Greek manuscript, that they back translated it from Latin into Greek so that they would have Greek support for it. So they went backwards with it. But I guess he goes after Hymenes. He says, just produce the Greek manuscript. Let me see it, and I'll add it in mine. And none was ever produced for the polyglot. All right. And then he goes into Thomas Aquinas's testimony, in which Thomas Aquinas says that it was actually the Arians that put the verse in. Well, he said Thomas Aquinas is reporting that it's been said that the Arians actually put the verse in, not took it out. And then Erasmus goes into it's not necessarily orthodox to have it, nor is it necessarily orthodox not to have it. Depends on your presuppositions going into the verse, whether you'll read it as a Trinity verse or you'll read it as something other than the Trinity. All right. I gave you those 10, and I missed the last argument Erasmus makes against this comma. And when I was going through this years ago, a friend of mine texted me, he goes, I asked you about this 5 or 6 years ago. And he says, you have a very different answer then than you do now. I was like, well, 5 or 6 years ago, I was in a different position. I said, but yeah, that's true. This is I did change my views on this probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And but there were 2 super compelling arguments for me during that time frame that I held to the comma. I defended the comma based on 2 arguments. One was the one from Jerome, the fact that Jerome was saying that he added it. That one was highly influential on me. And so now I don't hold to that one, and I understand why most people don't hold to that one. But the second one, it took me a long time to track down information. And that is the last one Erasmus addresses in his defense for why the comma should not be included. And the last one is the grammar issue. The grammar issue, you can't see it in the English, but in Greek is a gendered language. If you're familiar with Spanish or French, those are also gendered languages. English, we don't have gender, right? We don't say that the table or the chair is feminine, okay? It's just what it is. In French or English, a table or a chair will be feminine or masculine, depending on the language. In Greek, it's the same way, okay? In Greek, it's the same way. They have feminine and masculine and neutered nouns, adjectives, verbs, etc. And so when you look at the comma in question, you'll see that there are 3 that bear witness. And then it will list the 3. And the three that it lists are the water, the blood, and the spirit. Thank you. I was getting ready to say the next three. I didn't want to say. And you read those are all neutered. Okay. But the three that bear witness, or the three that are one, the three that are agree in one, is masculine. And you can't, this is what we would call gender discordance, where you gave a masculine adjective to neutered nouns. And that's not how it's supposed to work. That's clear. That's what this suggested. That's not how it's supposed to work in Greek. If you have an adjective describing nouns, the adjective has to match the same gender as the nouns. Okay. So if you have three neutered nouns and you have one adjective to describe all three of them, the adjective itself should be neutered. If you have feminine, then the adjective should be feminine. If you have a mix of nouns where some of the nouns are masculine and some of the nouns are feminine, then the adjective goes masculine. Okay, masculine is the default. So we have a gender discordance without the comma. Some would argue and say, well, once you put the comma in, now we have a mix. You had the three that were neutered, and now you have the Father, the Word, and the Spirit. And we have at least one masculine in there. And so therefore you have a mix, and therefore the adjective can now be masculine, and the gender discordance is resolved. I can't tell you, a while ago, I was studying on the Trinity. I still am. And this issue of this verse comes up in nearly every book on the Trinity at some point as to what to do with the comma. And when I was on the KJVOTR only position, when I was in that position, we'll talk about that again in a moment. Almost every book, they reference this verse. They will eventually get to this verse, and then they'll talk about the gender problem, and they'll weigh heavily on the gender problem and say, therefore, the verse has to be in there to resolve the gender discordance. All right, well, Erasmus deals with this. And I love Erasmus because Erasmus is no joke with Greek and Latin and other languages. He really knows what he's talking about. And so let's see if I don't want to get out of order for this. All right. There's a couple of things I want to address. One, that this gender discordance, how do people answer it today? Because most of our translations don't have it. Most of our Greek New Testaments today don't have it. And I found two ways that people answer it, and then I'll address how Erasmus answered it. All right. So one way is by saying, well, it's a solecism. And we talked about solecisms before. I'll just bring it back up. A solecism is sometimes when you break the grammar rules in order to make a point, or just because that's common how people speak sometimes. I talked about how I might say something to the effect of, I take this from a friend of mine, his example, Dwayne Green. He said, I might say, I ain't got no money. But everybody knows what I mean when I say that. And for you to misunderstand me is to do so intentionally because you don't like the way I said it, right? If I say I ain't got no money, you know I mean I don't have money. But you will correct me by correcting my grammar and saying, oh, so you do have money, because you employed a double negative there. And you also use the word ain't, which isn't really a word. I actually don't know if that's a word anymore or not. But in any case, but you know what I meant, even though I broke the grammar rules. That's how solecisms work, where you say, hey, this is just not proper grammar, and therefore it's a solecism because everyone can understand you, but you're not employing proper grammar. So then the question is it possible for an author of the New Testament to break grammar rules under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit? Is that possible? This is actually a really interesting question as you think about it. Is the Holy Spirit constrained to man-made grammar rules when writing the New Testament? Does he have to follow the rules we put in place? I think the answer is complicated. I think it's a yes and a no. I think it's a yes in the sense that the Holy Spirit is going to constrain himself to our communication so that he can communicate with us through any writing. But I think it's no, that he doesn't have to follow it to its precision as long as the message is communicated. And some people aren't going to like that answer, but that is the answer. The Holy Spirit's not going to miscommunicate to you, which means he's going to follow some grammar rules, but he's not obligated to follow all of our grammar rules as long as the message is communicated. Why? Because our grammar rules aren't even perfect, right? Our grammar rules aren't even. So some have said what John does here is a solecism. He's broken the grammar construction, either because this was intentional, because he's trying to make a point, or it's the way he handled things. And I talked about that last week where I said, if you text with me, you'll notice that I use ellipses all the time incorrectly. I'm not leaving anything out. I'm just creating a break in my thought. I don't capitalize my I's unless autocorrect capitalizes it for me. So if I say I am going to the store, it's a lowercase I unless autocorrect fixes it. These are just things that I do that I know that are wrong, but I do them anyway. There's other places where people have identified that John has also broken or has created gender discordance in other places, both in this epistle and in Revelation and in the Gospel of John. So it's possible that this is something that John does occasionally. Also, we have noticed that there are other places in the New Testament by Peter, for example, in 1 Peter, where there are other grammar rules that we expect to be followed that aren't followed. And so basically what I'm just getting across to you is we have grammar issues in the New Testament that don't follow all of the grammar rules, yet the communication is not lost in any event. So that's one possible way people answer it today. The next possible way is, I hate when I write myself too many notes. Oh man, I should have at least put it in bold. There's a technical term and I want to use the technical term and I don't want to say it wrong. So anyway, I'll move on to the next one. But the next one, I really want the technical term. There it is. I found it. Construction ad sensum. Construction ad sensum. All right. So what is construction ad sensum? One of the things that I addressed in my own personal wrestling with this is we haven't gotten to the manuscript evidence yet, but when we do get to the manuscript evidence, that's next. You're going to see that there are no Greek texts that have this. And where are the Greek texts coming from? They're coming from the Byzantine Empire. And what language do they speak in the Byzantine Empire? Is Greek. And so Greek is their natural language, and they are moving to the West, and they're teaching the Greek language to those who are speaking other languages, but to those who are educated in Latin primarily. And so what bothered me about this argument was we have hundreds of manuscripts covering over 1,000 years of church history, and none of them are corrected by the people who speak Greek. Scribes are writing these, and we find evidences of places where grammar is corrected, either because a previous scribe messed it up or because the grammar rules have changed. And so sometimes the grammar is updated in the manuscripts. And so what bothered me was if this is such a glaring problem for Greek scholars today, if this is a glaring problem for Greek scholars today, why is it that native Greek speakers don't have a problem? Why aren't they correcting it? Why aren't they seeing the issue? And so there's one guy in church history who also brings up the grammar in 1 John, or the comma, I should say, in the comma. And that man is by the name of Gregory of Nazianzus. Gregory of Nazianzus does comment on the fact that there's gender discordance in the comma. And he supports it. And he never once mentions the comma itself. He mentions the gender discordance in the omission of the comma without ever mentioning the comma. He doesn't know it exists. And he supports the gender discordance. He says it belongs. And it's very technical, but he spends about 4 or 5 paragraphs building up to the gender discordance issue and then suggesting that there is no issue here. This is only an issue if you don't know Greek. And Gregory of Nazianzus supports that. Now, Erasmus picks up on that. This construction ad sensum is intended to draw your attention to also maybe not just draw your attention, but to create a point that he wouldn't have been able to create otherwise, except that he broke the grammar rules. Okay, broke the grammar rules. It's actually not a breaking. It's a unconventional way of saying something. Okay, it's an unconventional way of saying something. So he's not technically breaking grammar rules. He's just saying it in a way that you wouldn't expect to say it. Normal. Now, Gregory of Nazianzus also does not believe that this section is Trinitarian, which is also interesting. So remember, I'm going to flip back just so we can see the context here. Let's see, I'm on slide 467. We're going to go back to 453. We see here that it says, who is the one that conquers the world, but the one that believes that Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus Christ. He is the one who came by water and blood, but not by water only, but by water and by blood. And the Spirit who testifies, because the Spirit is truth. For there are three that testify, the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and these three are in agreement. So in the Latin Church, this was allegorized into a Trinitarian interpretation. Not that that's necessarily wrong, but that's how they did it. And that Trinitarian interpretation becomes a gloss. That gloss becomes a marginal note. That marginal note finds its way into the text. That's what's happening. However, Gregory of Nazianzus says that this isn't, he doesn't allude to the Trinity at all. He says that these three witnesses are the witnesses of Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ came in the water, the blood, and the Spirit. And what's John doing here is he's defending the incarnation of Christ, that he came in all three forms, in these particular three forms. So he's defending the incarnation of Jesus, which he does multiple times throughout the book of 1 John, or the epistle of 1 John. In fact, it's one of the main themes through 1 John. If you deny that Jesus came in the flesh, you're not of the Father. That's in 1 John. So here, instead of it being a Trinitarian passage, Gregory of Nazianzus is saying this is an incarnation passage. Okay? Food for thought. I'm not going to weigh in on that. That's for like an exegesis lesson. Now, let me go back to, what slide did I say I was on? 467. That went one too far. Okay, so that's what Gregory of Nazianzus does. Erasmus leans into that. He says this is how Erasmus is going to end, and I'm going to move on because I don't want to run out of time. I could spend forever on this. In fact, there is so much written on this subject, which is why any textual variant we talk about in this class, this is the one we spend the most time on. All right, so this is Erasmus, his annotation on the comma. And again, remember, he knows Greek very well. He's quite talented. He says, it will torture the grammarians that the Spirit, water, and blood are modified by the phrases, these are three and these are one. For the particular reason that the words Spirit, water, and blood are grammatically neuter in Greek. But the apostle pays more regard to the sense than to the words. And for the three witnesses, as if they were three people, he has supplied three things: Spirit, water, and blood. You use the same manner of speaking if you say, the building is a witness to the kind of builder you are. And so what he says, what he's describing here is essentially construction ad sensum. That's what he's describing, where you change the sense, you change the construction to reveal a sense. It's very technical, okay? And if you don't understand it, that's okay. 2 points I want to make from this. One, if anyone is going to bring up the issue of the grammar in the comma, okay, then they need to bring up construction ad sensum. And they need to be able to explain it to you and why it fails as an explanation. If they can't, they don't know what they're talking about. Find someone who does. All right. So this becomes an issue. If they are a TR only advocate or a KJV only advocate, they should be bringing up Erasmus, since Erasmus deals with the issue. If they're not bringing up Erasmus, it's either because they don't know what Erasmus has said on the subject, which is what I hope is the case, or they're refusing to tell you. They're hiding. Erasmus should be brought into this conversation because Erasmus deals with it. Gregory of Nazianzus deals with it from a grammatical standpoint. And the fact that there's no other Greek speaker who brings it up weighs heavily on me. And so the grammar issue that I used to use to defend the comma, I now say ought not to be used. It's been addressed. It's been handled. All right. So there's that. That was the last one. All right. And so we talked about last week. This is still that was new information, but it's still technically part of the review because we got past that point last week. We talked about how did Protestants handle the comma when Erasmus said it didn't belong, and he had two editions that didn't have it. Well, we talked about Tyndale. He brackets it and puts it in lower, in a smaller font to let the reader know it might be spurious. Coverdale does the same thing. Matthew's Bible does the same thing. Taverner's Bible, here we go. Taverner's Bible does the same thing with a footnote that says that this is printed, that is printed in other characters after the judgment of Erasmus in his annotations be not the words of John, the writer of this epistle, but came to be put in by some other. That's Taverner's. I think that's a good note. And then the last one, oh, I thought I deleted that one. Then the last one is the Great Bible that still brackets it and puts it in small font, and we don't get a Bible that doesn't distinguish it from the rest of the text until the Geneva Bible, and the Bishop's Bible and the KJV Bible follow the Geneva in that practice. All right, and then we got to here and we talked about the footnotes that a few late Greek manuscripts and some late Greek, a few late Greek manuscripts and some late Vulgate manuscripts add the comma. And then here on the NKJV footnote, we have NU and M omit the words omit the comma. So what is NU and M? NU is an abbreviation for Nestle Aland, UBS. They are identical Greek New Testament texts. They are now, they weren't when this was written. They are identical Greek New Testament texts with their annotations are different. Okay, that's what separates the two texts are the annotations, not the text itself. So the NKJV lumps them in together because they usually are pretty identical even at this point. And then the M stands for majority text. We talked about that, but that's not really an argument anymore. And so I have to make couple of clarifying. This was some of the feedback I got this week. I talked about 3 modern critical text positions. What's a critical text? Remember, a critical text is when you lay out the manuscripts in front of you, you evaluate the textual variants, and then you make a decision as to which textual variant you think belongs in the text. You write that down, you create a new text. Your product, your finished product is a critical text. Okay, and so all of these, we're all dealing with critical texts all the time because we're not dealing with manuscripts themselves physically. We deal with the critical texts that are derived from the manuscripts. So there are 3. I listed reasoned eclecticism, that's the camp I'm in, Textus Receptus or KJV only, and Byzantine or majority. Last week, I also had the word ecclesiastical there. I got some pushback. Some said, well, the Byzantine claims to be ecclesiastical, but so do the TR, and so do the reasoned eclecticism. So I said, okay, well, if all of you are claiming to have it, then none of you can have it. So I took it off my sheet. All right, I do that for my kids too. So I took it off. So it's just Byzantine majority. The reasoned eclecticism says, hey, listen, we're using the same methodology right from the beginning, the same types of methodology. We've refined it, we've updated it, but it's the same types of methodology. So our methodology is the ecclesiastical position. Textus Receptus said, well, this is what the church has received after the Reformation, so we're the ecclesiastical position. And Byzantine majority says, well, this is what the church has received before the Reformation based on the manuscript evidence, so we're the ecclesiastical position. And I just said, well, forget it. It's not a helpful term if we're all arguing over it. So we just went with reasoned eclecticism, Textus Receptus, KJV, and the Byzantine/majority position. Remember, majority position isn't really a position anymore. It's Byzantine priority because there are some exceptions where they don't go with the majority. And let me explain. They're not going with a minority either. The Byzantine, one of the benefits of being in the Byzantine text camp is that you will never select a minority reading, but you might not select the absolute majority reading. For example, if you have a reading that has 49% of attestation in manuscripts and a reading that has 51% of attestation in manuscripts, there are occasions in which the Byzantine priority position, some of the men listed below it, will pick the 49% because of internal evidence instead of the 51%. And therefore, it's not truly the majority reading, but it is still a Byzantine reading, if that makes sense. So it's a nuanced position. The majority position, because of that position not being consistent, has tended to drop, and we're left with the Byzantine priority position. So I won't reference the majority position again, except for just to explain that. One of the other issues I got pushback on was I had Dean Burgon with Scrivener over here. Scrivener agrees often with Dean Burgon, so I lumped them together, but I got pushback this week that said he doesn't always agree with Burgon, and there are times where he picks a minority reading in which it wouldn't be in the Byzantine category, and so he can't rightfully be called Byzantine. However, he also is not Textus Receptus only. He absolutely thinks the Textus Receptus has errors and needs to be updated. And so he ends up in reasoned eclecticism. However, he doesn't always agree with Westcott and Hort either, which is the line he's on, Westcott and Hort's line. And so he's got this very interesting position, but methodologically speaking, I think it's right to put him in reasoned eclecticism, even though he does agree often with the Byzantine text, but he doesn't agree with it exclusively in the way that Burgon does. And so, but within the reasoned eclecticism text side of the methodology, you can have people disagree. The issue of the disagreement will be, what's your criteria? What's your standard? How did you come to your conclusion? Whereas the Textus Receptus already has a conclusion decided for them, and so does the Byzantine. It's whatever the majority is, or relatively close to it, okay? They'll never pick a minority reading. But the Textus Receptus will pick minority readings. We just saw one. We're going to see it more. And the reasoned eclecticism will also pick minority readings. And so there are, and the other thing I didn't talk about last week, I forgot to include Wilbur Pickering in the Byzantine. He, interestingly enough, you see family 35 next to him. He doesn't just use all the Byzantine manuscripts. He uses one particular subset of Byzantine manuscripts and says that is where the apostles' inspired word is in family 35 of the Byzantine readings. So he's in a smaller subset of the larger group of Byzantine readings. We're not going to get into all that, but that's there for your information. So all of these positions are trying to answer one question. What did the apostles write? Or I should say, what did the authors of the New Testament write? What did the authors of the New Testament write? And then they will ask a second question. And this second question is really what I'm just kind of boiling it down to what the ultimate question is going to be. How are they going to come up with their reading? So on the reasoned eclecticism side, they're going to ask a number of questions, but the ultimate question is going to be, what reading best explains all of the other readings? So we have a reading, and this particular reading is either difficult, or it's old, or it's something. It's got a number of characteristics about it. And because of these characteristics, these other readings pop up. And we can explain those other readings by this reading. And so this one's got to be the original one. Okay. And there's a number of criteria for that. But that's the bottom line question. What reading best explains all of the other readings? For the Textus Receptus KJV side, they will ask the question primarily, what did the KJV translators decide? And why do I say that? Because even if you're Textus Receptus only, when you push hard on maybe the KJV translators got it wrong, and a different reading should be used within the Textus Receptus family, they will always default to whatever the KJV translators decided and defend that. So TR onlyism is really just KJV onlyism in my experience and in my upbringing. It's just an extra step. Instead of just going to the KJV, they will use the Textus Receptus to defend the KJV. And then when you push against the Textus Receptus, then it's just whatever the KJV translators decided. Okay. And then the last one is, what do the majority of manuscripts say, with the exception of maybe some internal evidence? So that's the Byzantine text. All right. So when it comes to, man, we are not going to get through all of Erasmus today. We'll get through the comma, though. We'll get through the comma. I'm going to finish that. We'll finish Erasmus next week. So why do these positions matter? Well, because now we're going to look at the manuscript evidence. Okay. And these positions are all derived by manuscript evidence, okay, except the Textus Receptus one. Okay, these are all derived from manuscript evidence. So what is the manuscript evidence for the comma? Well, this is the manuscript evidence that lacks the comma. These are all the manuscripts we have that do not have the comma in it. Okay, the Johannine comma, that whole phrase. There's over 500 of them. There are various dates listed up there, categorizing them into a particular century or centuries. All right, and all of these do not contain the comma. Now, I want to be clear because this is the silly pushback I get when I make these kinds of statements. Because the next question is going to be, well, could they have contained the comma? None of the manuscripts listed up here lack 1 John 5 verses before the comma and verses after the comma. So it's not like any of the manuscripts up here might contain Mark chapter 13 verses 1 through 8. And I'm saying, see, that manuscript doesn't contain 1 John 5, 7. That's silly, okay? That is not the argument I'm making. It has verses before and it has verses after, but it does not have the comma in it. We have over 500 manuscripts. Timothy Berg did the work for this, not for me. I didn't do it, so I'm taking his work. And this has been verified multiple times that his work is good. Now, what about the manuscript evidence for the comma? These are the manuscripts we have for the comma. There's 10 of them. Now, if you look at this and you're immediately like, well, the manuscript evidence is clear that we should omit the comma because we don't have manuscript evidence for it, well, then you'll sit nicely in the Byzantine majority camp, right? The Byzantine majority camp says, hey, manuscript evidence, the majority, what the church has received is a text without the comma. And that's fine. If that's all the information you needed and you wanted nothing more, then you're in the Byzantine camp. But the reason the eclecticism is that's not good enough. It's not good enough just to count noses. This is just weight. Now we have weight that the comma should be omitted, but we need to evaluate the manuscripts themselves. And since I don't have time, and neither do you, we're not going to go through the 500 side. We'll go through the 10 side, okay? They've all been evaluated, but I'll show you through the 10 side why the comma should or shouldn't be added based on manuscript evidence. So the first one, we're going to go chronologically through these. So we're going to start at the earliest one, and we're going to move forward. But the earliest one up here is G88, and I have an asterisk. I have an asterisk because we're not going to cover it first. We're going to cover it probably one of the last ones, and you'll understand why when we get there. But the earliest is GA629. GA629 is, okay, I don't have it up here for you. Here we go. This is GA629. And it is the earliest Greek manuscript for the comma, is dated to the 1300s. It's in the Vatican Library. The manuscript is interesting because it's a Greek-Latin diglot. What's that mean? Remember, polyglot is multiple languages. Diglot is two. What are the two languages? Latin, Greek. They're written next to each other. Okay, and what happened is whoever was writing this diglot came to this passage, and they saw the comma in the Latin, wasn't there in the Greek, and they transposed it, they back translated it in from Latin to Greek. Now, how do we know that? Well, one of the ways we can know that, actually one of the ways we do know that, is Latin has remember we talked about gender? We have these genders. Well, one of the things that's also going to be genderized are the articles. And Greek has a lot more articles in it than English does or than Latin does. Latin doesn't have articles. So we have definite and indefinite articles in English. We have the and a and. A and. All right. Latin doesn't have either of those. Doesn't have a definite or indefinite. Greek has only definite articles, and they're all genderized. So there's a whole bunch of them. Okay. So when you read this in the Greek on the diglot, it's missing the articles. Why would it miss the articles? Because it was translated from a text that doesn't have articles. So they don't put them in. So we know that it's a translation of the Latin into Greek. Let's see. Yeah, okay. So also, this is an important point. Elijah Hickson is the one who's taking this work from. He's the one who's gone through the 10 manuscripts, and he's helped me out with this. He also does this because he grew up in the same camp I did. So he looked at all the textual variants in GA 629 compared to what most TR onlyists use, which is Scrivener's 1881. And he says there's 23 to 25 words, and there's 8 textual variants in this section, just in this manuscript. Food for thought there. It's not word for word identical. Next one is GA61. We already covered this one. GA61 is the one that was created contemporary with Erasmus and given to Erasmus as support. The next one is GA421. GA429. It's also in the 1500s, but this one is a GA. Did I say it? 429. It's in the margin. Okay, it's not in the text itself. It's put off to the side, and this one is. The manuscript itself is 14th century, so predates Erasmus by quite a bit, but the marginal note is contemporary with Erasmus. And they can tell that through paleography. They can tell that through ink, the ink colors, the ink composition, and things of that nature. So we know a later editor saw it and added it in the margin. The next one is GA 918. This was well after Erasmus was dead, and it is a copy of his 5th edition. So someone handwrote Erasmus's 5th edition. GA 2473, we'll come back. We skipped another one. We skipped 636. We'll come back to that one. But this one is this is 1634. We know because it actually has the date in it. So it's after the KJV was even done that this manuscript was created. This one is in the 1700s, GA 2380. Okay, 2318. 2318 is in the 1700s, so very late. Next one is GA 177, which is 1785. The manuscript itself is 11th century, but we have a note and dated and signed, so we even know who wrote it on this one. There's a marginal note, so this person has a marginal note on a 11th century manuscript. 11th century manuscript, but we have it dated and signed, so we know when the marginal note was put in. It was done by Ignatius Hart between in the month of 1785. Sorry, in the year of 1785, June 20th. That's how specific he got. So we know exactly the day that this one was written. All right, this is a 10th century manuscript. This is 1854. It is the comma in the margin. Right, no, this is a comma. Yeah, it is written in the margin. And 1854, we're right about to have the Civil War in America. That's when this manuscript was written. All right, back to G88. G88 is a manuscript from the 1200s. The marginal note we know is later. We know it couldn't be added before the 13th century, but we are pretty sure it happened after the Reformation, but we don't know exactly when. So we're not 100% certain, but based on the evidence we have, what we can delineate from it, it's post-Reformation marginal note on a 1200s manuscript. Okay, and then we have 636. Let's see, this one is contemporary. Or post-dates Erasmus. It doesn't contain the comma except in the margin. And it also has, I believe this one also has errors with the articles. Okay. So, all right, you guys came to class late, so I'm going to steal a couple minutes. 1 minute. All right. So one of the issues I have is after dealing with all this evidence, and they tell me, hey, we have manuscript evidence for the comma, and I demonstrate that their manuscript evidence is very weak at best and awful at worst. Or non-existent, if you're going to be honest, that we don't have manuscript evidence for this. And I try to demonstrate that the evidence for this either post-dates Erasmus or is coming straight from the Latin. It's not coming from the Greek. They will usually ignore me. They'll suggest that this isn't the case. And what I want to show you is a clip from a 3.5 hour long debate. And this one clip was actually massively influential on me, on moving me out of the Textus Receptus camp. And it's because of the way the Texas Receptus defender responded. It's a 1-minute clip. But what I'm going to show you is real quick here. This is a moderator of the debate. This is James Snap. He is a defender of the Byzantine position. This is Peter Gurry. He is a defender of the reasoned eclectic position. And this is Jeff Riddle. He's a defender of the Texas Receptus position. So we have all three camps up there. And at this point in the debate, they're talking about the comma, and Peter Gurry is grilling Riddle. And he asks probably the best question you could possibly ask. And Riddle's answer illuminated me to the fact that I'm not dealing with a camp that's being honest about the evidence. And here's what it is.
You know, when it comes to, I read, in thinking about getting together today, I read James's very helpful recent article on the Coma Ioanneum. And, you know, there are only, what, 5 manuscripts? It's the 1 John 5:7. And that's not a lot. I mean,
I want to base a position on what we don't have, though.
Well, I'm just saying,
base a position on what we do have.
I'm just saying, I think a lot of people who are laymen, when we talk about this, a lot of times they're thinking, well, there are thousands of manuscripts that exclude the Coma that are, you know, and we have ones from the 1st century, the 2nd century, the 3rd century. And
what do we need to convince you it's not original, Jeff? Because I kind of suspect there's nothing that would, right, given your position.
Probably not. I mean,
so why does it matter? It's a red herring.
Well,
all right. What evidence would convince you that it wasn't original? Because I suspect there wouldn't be. And he said, probably not. There is no evidence that would convince me. Peter will point out this debate is useless then, where I can give you all the objective evidence in the world, and you will not accept the evidence. And he openly admitted. All right, we'll finish up with Erasmus next week, but I actually want to end this class with the words from F.H.A. Scrivener. He says this about the Johannine comma, and I think this is a good way to conclude this section. He says, there's no vestige in Codex Sinaiticus, which we haven't talked about yet, but we will soon. There's no vestige in Codex Sinaiticus, nor indeed in any other manuscript worth naming, of the famous interpolation of what are called the 3 heavenly witnesses, or the Johannine comma, as we've been calling it, in verses 7 and 8, which yet deforms our authorized translation. He means the KJV. We are here treading over the ashes of many a fiery debate, but the flame which once raged so fiercely is well nigh extinct. It may be doubted whether a single person now living who is capable of forming an intelligent judgment on critical subjects believes or professes to believe in the genuineness of that interpolated gloss, familiarly known as the text of the 3 heavenly witnesses. That it has no right to hold a place in the body of Scripture, we regard as certain. Thank you.